To call the honourable member for Barara.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first say that I support the instrument, but I also support the amendment moved by my colleague, the member for Cook. And I want to just put first a proposition about my own level of engagement in these issues. I have always taken, in the whole of my time in public life, a passionate interest in the plight of refugees, people who are the victims of torture, people who are persecuted, people who have to flee. The difficulty has always been that there are many more people in those circumstances than we are able to help, or the rest of the world is able to help. When you've got 10 million people who have been found to be refugees and 40 million people who have been displaced, the enormity of the problem can be understood. I've sometimes joked with some people that given the accommodation that's been given to people smugglers to choose who should be helped by being able to access Australia, perhaps the government should go to refugee camps like Kakuma in Africa, 90,000 people, and say, if you pay the government $10,000, we'll give you a place. And people look at me in absolute horror that anybody would suggest that the way in which you obtained a place was the government charging $10,000 for those that it would accommodate. Well, it's always seemed to me, if it was so ridiculous in relation to a government to do that, why would you accommodate it with policies that have brought large numbers of people to Australia? I have been fascinated by the words uttered by the ministers, that this is a matter in which we need to work together. This is a matter where politics is over, a matter where, words of the Minister for Immigration, above politics. Well, I have to say that there were some people on the other side who had no trouble in pursuing politics to suggest that I had no interest in the plight of genuine refugees in need of help, and characterised the measures that were implemented by the former government, which brought the smuggling to an end, effectively, and enabled us to concentrate on those who need help most, that this government thinks it is now beyond politics when their measures to unwind the policies that worked have brought about this horrific circumstance which we now face. And I read the statement of the Minister, and I only quote paragraph 5 of the advice of the Department to him, that says in the year 8th September 2012 there have been 135 boats carrying 8,851 passengers. The number of passengers who arrived in the first 7 months of 2012, 7,120, exceeded the number who arrived in total in each of 2011 and 2010. The enormity of that problem was not created by the opposition. The enormity of the problem that we face, the loss of life that we have suffered, has been brought about because the policies that worked had been changed. Now, I welcome the fact that on this one aspect, the designation of Nauru as a regional processing country is being pursued. I welcome the fact that Manus Island will be pursued. But I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, I have always seen this as an issue in which, if you are going to have effective policies in place, you need to use every weapon in your armoury. It's not a menu that you can pick and choose from. And you have to be realistic, totally realistic about what you're doing. If you are determined to close down the people smuggling, you have to tell it as it is. And this government still wants to use words that suggest that they're not serious. Let me just deal with the matters that are before us. At the moment, we've got a report that the government says it's accepted. It's going to implement all of the measures that have been suggested. But we're still only dealing with offshore processing at this point in time. The report that the government had suggests more needs to be done. And the only other matter the Minister of Home Affairs wanted to mention was an increase in the size of the refugee program. Nobody seems to have focused on other aspects of the advice, and I just mentioned two of them because the government's advice was quite clear. Australian policies do influence the flows of irregular immigration to Australia. Those settings need to address the factors of pushing as well as the pulling. When you go to the approach of the government's expert panel, the panel makes it very clear that the single most important priority of preventing people risking their lives on dangerous voyages is to recalibrate the Australian policy settings to achieve an outcome that asylum seekers will not be advantaged if they pay people smugglers to attempt dangerous, irregular entry to Australia instead of pursuing regular migration pathways and international protection. And it goes on to talk about some of the other incentives that are there. And it says incentives to use regular migration and protection pathways need to be complemented by policy measures that send a coherent and unambiguously clear message that the disincentives to irregular migration will be immediate and real. And I hear the words coming from the government as they say that people are going to be sent offshore for processing. I don't hear them saying unambiguously that the no disadvantage test will apply. I hear weasel words that suggest that if you've arrived in Australia by a boat, you might be sent to Nauru. I think the words they use, should be sent to Nauru. I never hear the words, will be sent to Nauru. And I understand why that's the case, because the government now has numbers that have exceeded even the capacity of Nauru and Manus Island to be able to take them. That's why they're using the weasel words. We're not dealing with the perception that Australia is closing its borders. And when you look at the other options that can in fact be taken, and in the government's expert panel they did it, they say they didn't recommend TPVs. And the government doesn't want to go down the route of TPVs, denying permanent residence to people found to be refugees if they happen to get to Nauru or Manus Island, are processed and are then brought to Australia for resettlement. But the government's panel, in paragraph 20, Roman numeral 20, on page 13, said other measures to disencourage dangerous and irregular maritime voyages to Australia should include changes to family reunion arrangements as they relate to irregular maritime arrivals in Australia, a more effective focus on returned failed asylum seekers to their country of origin, and more sustained strategies for disruption of people smuggling operations both in Australia and abroad. What they were saying was when they talk about eliminating the advantages of family reunion, use TPVs. Maybe not in the same words, but it was quite clear and unambiguous, and yet the government would have you believe that implementing all of the Howard measures is not something that this report suggested. And the other aspect that was particularly interesting to me in the report itself was the view that they had on turn back of vessels. And in page 53 of the report, paragraph 377, turning back irregular maritime vessels carrying asylum seekers to Australia can be operationally achieved and can constitute an effective disincentive to such ventures, but only in circumstances where a range of operational, safety of life, diplomatic and legal conditions are met. That's the advice that this government has received. Yet they would have you believe that you should not work to restore turnbacks. Look, Mr Deputy Speaker, if the government were serious about this issue and they wanted to get the politics out of it and they wanted to put in place measures that actually work and have been known to work, they'd get the politics out of it by supporting the amendment moved by the member for Cook. That's how you get the politics out of it. Clear and unambiguous. And even the government's own expert panel, sure, using a few weasel words not to make it look like they were putting it too much in the government's face, made it clear you get the migration benefits out. That's essentially TPVs by another name. Turn back of vessels. They say it is possible, and yet the government suggests that it's not. I said, as I dealt with this issue, the problem that the government, in pursuing the approach that it took in relation to this matter, is that they essentially walked away from effective cooperation with our neighbours because they weren't seen as being serious about people smuggling. I found an item in the Northern Territory News, it's probably in other newspapers, 9th of August this year, a message from Jakarta from a senior political leader in Jakarta, Indonesian MP, Muhammad Siddiq, who made it clear in relation to the unauthorised arrivals. And I quote, "The apparent lack of a working policy sending a message that Australia's borders were open." He goes on to say, "Indonesia is being dragged into the problem, significantly impacting. It's quite worrying. Australia must have strict and clear policy that explains whether or not they are still open." I mean, the Indonesians don't want people coming there seeking to access Australia unlawfully. They want Australia to be serious about these matters. They were distressed when the Howard measures that worked were being unwound for political reasons by this government. They made it clear when they used words like, "What are you doing about the sugar?" In other words, what are you, Australia, doing about the incentives that you have put into the system to bring people on boats, on dangerous voyages to Australia? Why do you expect us to help you when you're not helping yourself? And so we're still in this situation where the government thinks it's a menu. We'll take one measure, we'll open the route, hope it works. Well, let me say very clearly, I think the task is bigger and harder than the Howard government faced. The prospect of Nauru working alone, in my judgment, is quite remote. All of the measures that we used need to be brought to bear, and brought to bear quickly, if you're going to bring these matters under control. And the sooner the government comes to a realisation you can get the politics out of it by adopting the measures that we've argued for, in other words, accept the amendment, the sooner we get that politics out of it and real politics back into it, the better.